Christine with the Artist Pod, and today we're going to go in depth on how to draw an Eastern painted turtle. So, let's get arting. Alright, so here's the turtle. It's an Eastern painted turtle. They have multiple colors, so there's a ton of color swatches down here. So let's get started. Very much like with fur, I'm still going to be kind of overlapping these lines. However, well, I guess it's like that with fur too. I try to follow the contour of the head, even with fur. But when it's not fur, it's almost more important that you're following that sort of line. And we'll see, this is my drawn turtles before, but not a full figure, so we'll see how this goes. And again, this first step is just that sketching step, so I'm not putting a whole lot of pin pressure here. And I haven't quite decided yet what direction I'm going to draw the other colors, right? So it's got this dark green, which is darker than what I'm drawing, but again, because I draw in black, I have to choose a slightly lighter color. And so I don't know if I'm going to have the stripes going a different direction. Sometimes that can help indicate a different sort of coloration or direction or a different contour of something, or if I'll have them matching these lines here and going the same direction. A lot of little details in here with painted turtles, with the those lighter green, yellowish stripes. Trying to figure out what I did with these stripes in the middle. Sometimes I'll have a reference picture open. In fact, usually I do. I didn't open one, but I might have to. Either I'll just have a picture open on Photoshop, or I'll actually just Google it and be referencing a picture on Google, especially in a situation where there's a lot of fine detail like this, in case I need to reference it if I can't sort it out. But just like the fur, right, as I come to the edge, I'm rounding with the head. Unlike the fur, I am being much more careful along the edge, much like I am with the eyes. So I'm being a bit more precise with my lines here, but there's still some flexibility with the style, so it still doesn't have to be perfect. I'm just being more careful. And then I'm making sure that it all makes sense with every gap. What's nice about not having fur is it doesn't matter how long the strokes are. But turtles technically have some scales. I'm going to try a different technique than I usually do because they're much less noticeable, especially if they're in the water. You know, there's some sacrificing of detail that happens because he's swimming. So I'm going to try a different technique. Usually scales can take a while because I'll draw the individual scales. So it's a lot quicker to not do that. But obviously the longer you can make a stroke, the quicker a drawing goes. So when you're not bound by the length of the fur, or if it's a long-haired animal, it tends to go a lot quicker than if it's short-haired, because I can make these longer strokes and cover a lot of ground. But again, you know, I'm following that contour, so he has the little shoulder of the skin or neck, I guess, that comes kind of down and swoops, so I follow that line. I'm probably actually bunching these lines up too close. I'm almost creating the next step. Sometimes with animals like this, I catch myself doing that. Because it's not, it's almost easier to follow a contour than a fur direction change on like a lizard animal or something. You know, it's almost easier to sort out exactly how it's going, so sometimes I get ahead of myself and go a little overboard with the thickness of the lines right out of the gate. But it also helps. Sometimes the longer a stroke is, the thicker it can be because I'm putting a little bit more solid pin pressure through a longer stroke, right? Like I'm not releasing that pin pressure. And so sometimes inevitably that makes it a little brighter right out the gate. It can also be thinner if I'm making long strokes and not filling them in. I feel like at this point I'm already kind of committed to this. And all the little partial circles you see on the sketch under his foot here were trying to indicate scaliness in the sketch. Obviously that won't translate. It's just a guide for me to figure out where I'm going to do, you know, if I decide to do the scales. I haven't decided if I'm going to really articulate those fully or not. I'm going to give a technique a try and we'll see how it goes. In which case I went ahead and sort of filled those in. Adding little details can add a lot to an image, so we'll see. But that would be done. I had made that decision to do it in the highlights and shadow phase, not in the sketch out phase. So it would be the next step if I decide to add the scales. Usually that's not how I do it. Usually I sketch it out and I'm sketching every individual scale, but that takes a long time, and I typically reserve that for when I'm doing a full portrait. Like the Komodo dragon I did. It has a lot of individual scales, and so there's a lot of detail that goes in that. Or snakes. But because I'm doing a full figure of the turtle, I'm less likely to do that. And they do have claws, but they're dark, so I'll probably use the gray of the shell color to fill in the claws. They're pretty cute though. And I'm just connecting it back up, right? Like, so I have this, let me pop, I've made a line there for a reason. I have this almost flatter section coming up, and then it's going into this, so right, I'm creating that little swoop here by just bringing it and bringing that back up right here. And the reason I just erased a little bit is I think I have this almost section of skin that's angled in. That's why I drew it this way. So I was trying to indicate a different contour, so I'm going to change a little bit of how the lines are going there. Still need to connect it back, so I'm still going to be looping that back in because I don't want any line conflicts, which can be noticeable, especially in shadows. Right, so we're just going to bring that back down. We've kind of indicated a hump. That works for me. And we're indicating that just with, you know, these changes in line direction to show that there was a different elevation. And in theory, what's really going to do it is highlights and shadows. And then the tail. And then this little line here is his mouth. Okay. So now we're going to go with, and I was kind of torn on the color. So first of all, when I'm choosing a darker color, right, I kind of stay in this region here. The reason for that is I print on a lot of neutral colored shirts, right? So like a dark heather gray, it'll start getting lost if I get any darker. That includes for gray. So when I'm choosing a gray, you'll see that I'm always choosing on kind of this upper section of the color spectrum. I'm not usually going down in here unless I'm drawing a darker color on a lighter one. So I could probably go a little darker with this green, but I'm happy at the moment where it is. Now his lighter green is kind of a yellowish, kind of a greenish. So we'll see if this color turns out well or not. We'll keep the same contour. I was debating as I was starting if I was going to turn it, but we'll keep the same contour I've already done. And their stripes don't have to perfectly match. You know, in a lot of things with nature, things aren't exactly perfect, so it's okay to have some variation. As long as they're close. And honestly, our eyes will pick up, you know, it'll be natural for us to see variation. So to indicate a mouth, it can be hard to see on them, just like we did with the animals, right? I'm going to have the lines stopping at the mouth. So that there's no overlap. It'll help indicate that it's there. But there's not going to be quite the same gap that you get with animals where you have some of that fur helping out. You know, in this case, sometimes, you know, fur will kind of go over just that little bit. It'll have a jagged edge, so in the mouth, trying to make sure that it's a little bit more even. So like with the eyes, I'm taking a little bit more care to make sure that that's definitely not overlapping. You can see my strokes have gotten a little heavier. It's just that this angle is a little harder for me. Twisting in my weird ways again. Now as I come down the middle like this, you can see I have some strokes kind of ending this way, some ending that way. So the middle is where I would bring it straight down and start to angle in those directions, and then you angle off as you go to the side. Yeah. So that's what we got so far. And these spots here are going to be red. And this isn't a stripe, it's one of his claws. It's a little more jagged because of the way his arm is bending, right? Like, you know, his skin's folding up. It helps add to that realism because of how he's swimming. Now I have to make sure here that the lines all create a gentle line all the way to the tip of the tail, right? So I'm actually going to take this off. Like, I can't have a weird bulge because the tail is still the same shape, whether or not there's lines. Different colors coming up. Yeah. Doing good. So we'll add the red. And then we'll move on to the shell. The shadows and highlights will really give him a nice burst. I'm just making sure his nose is clearly defined. So I have the shell a little lighter. I actually really debated on that because they have some pock marks of darker, some lighter. Sometimes their shells don't look all that dark, and I'm still debating. Maybe I should just pull it into this grayer color. We'll see how this goes. Just making sure I can reference that later. The light strokes, you know, you can get a read on any of these, but the light strokes here are hard to make sure I get an accurate color to what I've already used. So having the swatches, even if I'm making a decision right now and about to use it, I'm going to probably be drawing on it so lightly that it's not going to be effective for me to be able to match the color again. Just like with the skin, I can do bigger strokes here, but I'm going to stay contained with every individual part of the shell, right? So almost like scales, but much bigger scales. Which means when I add shadows and highlights, I'm going to be adding them to the individual sort of segments. So one of the most important things when doing that is making sure that even with these sort of stripes in the shell, that the lines above and below match each other. It's not as important that the lines match perfectly from section to section as it is of making sure that the lines above and below a stripe are the same, because that will look obvious if it's not. Whenever I come to the edge, you'll see that I shorten my strokes. That's when I'm, trying to be careful of how, of an edge, right? Like I'm trying not to go over into the next segment. Same thing I do when I'm drawing around eyes or the edge of edge of anything, really. The shorter strokes give me more control. An easy way to keep contained within a line like this, you kind of saw me do it, right? Like I swoop in, just like I did under the eye on the red panda. It's a swoop and an in. So I'm doing these almost humped strokes, which seems weird, but really is an effective way to follow a contour without going too crazy. I mean, it's probably still going to be a little off, but it's going to be much cleaner line than if I had just drawn this edge straight. By swooping myself in, I'll keep myself a little cleaner on that edge. Same reason I kind of turn in when I come to the bottom here, which is actually effective because the shell probably has a little bit of a hump to it. And so by turning down, not only am I indicating it, but I'm making it a little easier for myself to keep a straight line. Now when I get into here, you might see a little bit of the undershell, which is going to be a lighter, this lighter color here is going under. Sometimes you can see a little bit of that on just the edge of the shell, so I'm probably going to have a little bit of that up there. So as I bring these lines down, especially down the middle, trying to angle them towards the middle. Follow in from the tail. And then of course the sides are coming down. I think that will work better than having these just connecting across, because it'll really help differentiate the different sections on the turtle shell without being blatantly wrong or causing any sort of line conflicts, because they're different sections. An easy way to do that is to obviously turn the direction it's going, but I always try to maintain the contour of the shell just like I do with skin. As long as I'm doing that, it should work. And again, just making sure that above and below the lines that are going to be a different color, that it's all the same direction. Because if it's not, that will be obvious. And so it's really a lot of little kind of details. So right now it feels a little slow going. But once it's sketched in, adding the highlights and shadows should make it go quick. He's in water, right? So that can dull shadows and highlights. But I still want to have a good burst on him so he doesn't get, I don't want him too faded. I haven't decided what direction my light source is coming from yet. So I'm still going to make him pretty bright, even though, you know, he is in water. There would be some fading happening. I'm debating on if, also if I should try and add a little bit of like a highlighted water on top of him to make it look like there's some reflections happening. I've done that before. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. So I'm probably going to be experimenting with that a bit too. See how it works. I've done it with the otter and the humpback whale, but I didn't have as much success with the goldfish I did. So if it doesn't work, I just erase it. But if it works, sometimes it adds a lot of little detail. You can also, like the otter, I was able to add bubbles and it looked really effective, but sometimes that doesn't always work. And so I'm probably not going to add bubbles with the turtle. I certainly didn't with the fish or the whale. It's not as effective, but it can be those little details like that that, you know, will surprise you as to how much it can add. Just like whiskers on an animal, you know, sometimes that can add a lot to an image. I'm always thinking of little extra things to add. Scales typically are a wow factor all on their own. And detail can certainly be a fine image, but sometimes I'm thinking of other things I could add to give it a little extra pop. And the turtle itself has a lot of small details, so I probably don't need to add anything extra. But especially because he's in the water, there's an opportunity to maybe do a little bit more, if it works. Right, and you can see on this back side, as the contour changes here, I've changed the direction of the lines. Even this one, you know, it went straight back, and as the contour changed, I readjusted to the direction of the shell. Yeah, it's looking good so far, and you can see the different separations. A little harder in between here than down the middle, but highlights and shadows will take care of that. So even with these little ones, as I bring it around, I'm changing that angle. Now to get his little claws. I've got quite a lot. Claws are kind of rectangular-ish. So you can start at the top and fan it out. They're always going to be bigger at the bottom than the top, right? So sometimes I'll start at the tip and work my way in, right? And you just kind of sketch that in. Of course, sometimes I do it the other way, but making sure the tip looks nice and sharp is important, which is why I will start at the tip, is you want to make sure that ends in a nice lethal or, you know, scratchy looking point. All right, so that's where we are so far. We're going to add in this little bit of orangey color to his shell. And then we might go ahead and sketch in his eyes too, since turtle eyes are shaped so interestingly. And again, just that little bit of lighter color is on this top part of the shell, so I'm just adding that in. Not always, I don't feel like, from what I've seen, but sometimes you can see it, so we're gonna see it. It'll add a little bit of character to it and help add a extra splash of color. So their eyes color to him. That's my only concern. All right. You start to use a lot of colors like this, there's the worry that it's going to save as a big file. Probably will, but he is a little smaller, so maybe he won't. I have a feeling he will, though. I'll lightly sketch this in here. Yeah, there we go. He's looking kind of cute. So now we can start adding the shadows and highlights. We're going to start with his base green color. And I'm going to have the light source. Just debating on if I should have it coming straight down or from an angle. Let's do an angle. Let's do it over here, my favorite side, and have it coming from that direction. And make sure that you start a new layer. That is a mistake I have made, and it is a sad day when I have made that mistake. All right, so with the light source coming in from this side, right, you know, all of this is going to be in highlight, and that back side here is going to be in shadow. So we're just going to put full pin pressure. Really fill in those gaps. Now, where the fur we overlapped color changes, I won't do that if it doesn't have fur. So it's gonna be a sharper transition from one color to another, which it would look like a sharper transition as well on the animal itself, right? The fur helps it, the fur makes those color transitions more subtle. But when there's no fur, you don't have that hair kind of overlapping. You don't really need to do that because it wouldn't really be that subtle. There's going to be a clear change from one color to another. Now his eye, you know, you can see where I've created a delineation where his eye sort of sticks out from his face. So that upper edge is going to have just that little bit of shadow, right? Because it's rounding. All edges will have a shadow. And then as we get towards the eye, we'll have another shadow as well. And he's got a little bit of an eyelid, so I'm going to give his eyelid a little bit of a pop. But of course this front spot would also be in shadow. That underneath probably will be in highlight. And under here will be in shadow. We're going to have this have a little burst of highlight right underneath his eye, where the light is probably catching, but then this going into shadow. And under the eye here, I'm going to have a little bit of shadow as well because the eye's jutting out before it kicks into a little bit of a highlight and goes immediately back into shadow. But that'll help sort of show the shadow of the eye. This would be in highlight because it's far enough to the side. It's not underneath, as would all of this. This transition above is going to be in highlight. And having a highlight against a shadow just helps reinforce the fact that an object was rounded, and so you have, you know, just that little bit of illusion happening there with the highlights and the shadows. You'll be able to see the edge of this because it's in that little bit of a shadow, whereas this is kicking in full highlight just above it. It'll create a more noticeable transition. Now where we have that flap of skin coming up here, I'm going to create just a little bit of shadow on that back side of that. I need to make sure that this looks like a little extra, like that little turtle head flap thing they have. So just like with the mouth, right, I'm going right up to the edge and I'm stopping. And I'm leaving that in a little bit of a shadow with the highlight kicking in, and then doing the little flap right separately. But I'm not putting a lot of pin pressure because there's not a lot of room to work, so in some ways it's also brightening up more than I would prefer, but it's not a full brightness. It's a small space to work in because I'm doing a full figure and I never really change my brush size, and so that can make it a little harder sometimes to get the same level of detail I do when I'm doing a portrait. I think shadow would be kicking in here, so somewhere in here there's a highlight to shadow change that happens. So this is going to be more in highlight, and I think it's just going to go into shadow there. Now the noses come up a bit, and if I want to make sure it looks like the nose is prominent, I am going to have to create probably a little bit of shadow as we start coming down this way, but let's give it its little burst and then have it go off into shadow. This side will be in highlight. This side of the light source. Other side might be in shadow. Oh, some of this is also going to be in shadow because it's on that underside of the nose. Now if he were out of water, I'd also add a burst of white because he'd be, wet. You'd have that extra burst of light. I don't know. In the water, you don't typically do that. I might still anyway to give him an extra sort of pop. But for now, we're going to just fill this in and worry about that when we get to it. So his neck here is going to be in shadow because he's under that shell. And it's rounding, away from the light source, at least in the front there. So whole back side's in shadow, but that front side, or this side, which is, I guess, underneath his foot, it's going to be in a little bit of a highlight. I'm going to fill it in lightly first so that I can just build the highlight up. Again, that extra control when I do it lightly really can help. Again, this side, this shoulder, neck, is going to be in shadow. It's under the shell. It's rounding away from the light source. Just bringing it all the way over to the head. And then this arm is actually probably going to have a little bit of a highlight. But just like the other one, I'm going to fill it in lightly first, and then we'll sort out the highlight from there. And of course there'll be a highlight on here as well. It's a little bit more obvious than the front 2 feet. You don't have the barrier of the shell and the shadow of the shell, blocking it, but I'm still going to lightly fill it in first before I go back in. Some of that is if I'm not used to drawing a certain animal, right? Like I draw animals a lot. I draw specifically animals with fur a lot. And so there's a different comfort level, whereas I've never fully drawn a turtle. And so I'm taking a little bit extra control by lightly filling this in so that I can sort it out in an easier way, right? So that's my way of handling the fact that I've never drawn a turtle before. I'm sorry, I've drawn a portrait of a turtle before. I've never drawn a full body turtle before. And so it's going to allow me extra control as I do it so that I don't mess it up. Or at least I do it well enough that it doesn't look wrong. That's really what we're going for. Now this one, the light source coming above, yeah, I think the whole thing would be in highlight, even up to the edge of the shell. I was just thinking about how the shell would impact it, but I believe that's going to happen because of the angle beyond what we could see. So that whole foot will be in highlight except the edge, where, you know, an edge goes into shadow always. And so like the toes section is going to be more in a shadow because it's facing away, but as far as the line of shadowing down here, I always try to visualize how the light source is coming in so that I can feel if it's gonna, or sort of figure out if it's gonna impact it or not, or how it's gonna impact it too. There will be a little shadow where this dips though, because that's dipping away from the light source, right? Like it's aimed over here. Light source is coming from over here, so that dip in the actual foot will create just a little one right through here. And on the back side of this little hump here, he's probably going to have a little shadow too. The hump of his toe. There's going to be some highlight. And that's going to go into shadow as there's a dip. Before there's another, potentially a little burst here. But almost none. Almost you can't see it. Now the tail probably is going to have some shell influence. That's why I left the shadow up by the shell. And the bright highlight goes into shadow as it comes around this way. Now for this greenish yellowish color. As I come over to the top of the nostril, I'm going to taper that just a little bit, although it's hard to see. There's not a lot of, space I'm working with. Now just like under here, there's going to be a little bit of shadow where that eye would be hitting away before it picks back up and goes immediately back into shadow. And just like the green, right, like under here, this would be in full highlight as it hits this edge of the eye, at least in this section. Over here we're going to have some in shadow. Just have to make sure that all of the different colors make sense with each other and that I've stayed consistent with my shadowing and highlights with my light source. There's also layer order that's important here, right? Like this yellowish color should be on top of the green. So I will do it after that darker green so that it gets more of a pop. Leaves me more room to fill it in fully. Underneath the nostril, I'm going to give it a little burst of highlight as it hits, right under here. Because it'd be catching just that little bit before it goes into a shadow. This side too, burst under the nostril, a little bit of highlight coming down before we transition into shadow. Now if his mouth doesn't show up nicely, I can always give that upper part of the bottom sort of lip a little highlight. Is a possibility. May show up just fine, but we'll see. There's tricks we can do to make sure it does show up. I don't know, it kind of shows up nicely. I might still give him a little bit of a burst right here. As this rounds around, be right at the top. Maybe a little bit on this side in general. Make it show up better. Yeah, I think that shows it pretty good. Alright. Now these, again, just like with the face, need to match it to what I've already done. Right, so this one stays in shadow. This one will be in partial highlight, which will be good because you can see the difference between the shadowed and the highlighted section. It'll help make the highlighted spots seem more like it's in highlight, whereas this is so much brighter. this line here than the rest of it. It may seem like it's in highlight, but when you compare it to an actual spot I've highlighted, it looks more like it's in shadow. So I'm going to treat each one of these as individual shapes. I mean, ideally you want to anyway whenever you're breaking down something, right? Like each individual shape makes it easier, but especially true when dealing with shells. So I'll be allowing that. I'll be fixing some of it, I'll be tempering it out, but I'm going to act as if this is an individual object, and then I'll temper it out later. Which means the edges are going to go into shadow. But the shell as a whole is turned towards the highlight, so it's going to get a nice burst of light. Right, with the highlight coming in over here, shell's kind of turned that way, so we're probably going to hit a little bit of a shadow along this edge, and then again along that edge, and then of course along the bottom, but otherwise it's going to be in highlight. Now as I come to this side, right, I have a bigger shadow happening, but you can see that the shadow here on this one isn't as deep as this one. So I'm just gonna fix that. So as I do it, I need to make sure that they're all lining up, right? I don't want to misalign something because it'll be noticeable. Now as I bring the shell around this way, these little pieces along this edge are going to be going into shadow a bit. So I'm lightening up how much pin pressure and highlights I'm adding, but I'm still giving them a little burst so that they're distinguishable. Just not a lot. Then we just need to add the lighter shell color and the red. Before I do that, let me also get his claws before I change colors. Right, so just like with everything else, they're more of a triangle, but the back side's still going to be in shadow. Sometimes you can't get that quite as nicely because they'll be thin. Right, so I'm going to come up here and make sure that's nice and claw-like. And then try to put the back side in shadow. Over here a little less so because it's in shadow. Just need to make sure that it fits and it works. And we'll probably give it a little bit of a burst just to indicate it's rounded. And again, because there's just less space, sometimes you can't exactly, you know, have all the edges in shadow like we should and stuff, but it still works. It's smaller, so some of the details are kind of lost anyway, and so it still reads okay. Let's go for that lighter shell color. This little burst of color will be in shadow. Most of this will be in shadow down underneath him, but probably have some catching the light because it's angled up. And so because it's angled up, it might still be catching even though it's tucked under the top shell. So there's going to be a pretty extreme shadow, but there's probably still enough to catch a little bit of light. Not on the edge though. The edge, of course, would still be rounding into shadow. And now his eyes. Alright, so we're going to do a little bit of a highlight. Oops, a little bit of highlight up here. I'm going to have this going into shadow. Same thing over here. But going into shadow. And then keep forgetting about the red on his face. I need to do that too. A lot of this may be just a lot of small fine tuning on it. I think he's looking pretty good. Come in and fix how the shadow's coming down his nose just a little bit. Give it a little extra burst before it changes over. Just making sure his nose is catching the light nicely. And as it bends away, there'd be a little bit of highlight coming down it. Yeah, I think that looks good. So, usually I'd add a light flare. Underwater, it won't necessarily have a light flare. I'm debating on if it's something I may still add to the eye. Like a nice thin, small, little bit of highlight. Let's see how that looks. Let's see if I draw it, if I have any better luck. Alright, so this is going to be a little bit of an experiment. I'm not sure how this is going to work on the turtle. It is something I have used on both the humpback whale and the otter I've done. It's just kind of randomly lightening up and adding a little burst of blue in kind of a subtle way that looks like it's adding some water, you know, some reflections of water, the way the light would burst through. So let's see. Typically, when I do it, it's going to be quick, random. Don't want it overpowering, so we don't want too much. I want it to seem like it's giving the shell a burst of highlight, right? And then the face and everything else. I'm trying to decide if I like it or not. I think I'm gonna ditch it for now. So all I'm doing here is adding a little bit of highlight around the nose. I'm gonna do this one better though. It's not much, it's just a few lines of white. Again, I'm still kind of experimenting. I've done all of these techniques before, but sometimes, depending on the animal, you don't know exactly how they'll work out. And that gives him a good burst of light on his nose, so I'm going to go ahead and build that in. It doesn't have to be a lot. It just, you know, shows that the light's catching in a different way there, or a little brighter, that spot's a little bit more in the light. It's kind of the spot that would have the brightest highlight, which is where you would do it. bearing in mind where the light source is. And then sort of lightly adding in a burst of a brighter color. Yeah, that adds a nice little effect to him, I think. I'm going to do one more little pass with blue. Very sort of subtly. And all the spots that are in highlight. Now this is not something I've tried before. Just going to see if this gives it that little bit of water reflection I was trying to go for. And I'm doing this by just sort of squiggling my lines over where I put the white. Not leaving my lines straight. Just giving them just that little bit of wobble, because that's what's going to make it work, if it works. Alright, I think I'm going to ditch the blue. We'll go with just the white highlight. So I think I like that better in the way that turned out. But, you know, that's also the wonderful thing about Photoshop, right? Like if something doesn't work, as long as I've done it on the right layer, I can just ditch it. And so it gives me a lot of freedom to experiment, which I really enjoy. Because you never know, sometimes you come up with something incredible just by experimenting. But I think this works. Alright, so that is how you draw an Eastern painted turtle. I hope that was helpful. In the floating nether next to me I have other videos of art tutorials I've done, and I will see you all soon. Thank you so much. Take care.